For over a century, the border between the United States and Canada wasn't just the longest undefended boundary on Earth. It was the foundation of the most integrated, reliable, and lucrative economic alliance in human history. But in a matter of months, that foundation was shattered. When the president openly threatened to annex Canada as the 51st state and slapped punishing 25% tariffs on America's closest ally, the mainstream coverage treated it like just another fleeting moment of political theater. They watched the social media posts. They listened to him refer to the Canadian Prime Minister as a future governor. But the part most people are missing is what happened next. The Canadian leader didn't just issue a polite diplomatic protest. He executed a ruthless, calculated pivot away from American reliance, a strategic rupture, and he took billions of dollars of trade, tourism, and global leverage with him. By the end of this analysis, you will understand exactly how an attempt to bully Ottawa engineered an unprecedented retaliation, why American border towns and taxpayers are suddenly footing the bill, and the one crucial number that changes the entire picture. To understand the magnitude of what just happened, you have to step back and look at the bigger picture of what the United States and Canada actually are to each other. They are not just neighbors. They are not just allies. They have been, for all intents and purposes, a single, massive, breathing economic organism. If you drive a car that was manufactured in North America, the parts in that car cross the United States-Canada border an average of 7 times before the vehicle was ever driven off the lot. 7 times. A steering column is stamped in Ontario, shipped to Michigan to be assembled, shipped back to Windsor for finishing, and sent back to Ohio to be put into a chassis. It is a circulatory system. The Ambassador Bridge, which connects Detroit, Michigan to Windsor, Ontario, carries roughly $400 million in bilateral trade every single day. That is one bridge. 25% of all merchandise trade between the two countries goes across that one span of concrete and steel over the Detroit River. The power grid in the American Northeast is completely intertwined with the hydropower generated in Quebec. The American agricultural sector relies on Canadian fertilizer. The economies do not sit next to each other. They are woven together at a microscopic level. For decades, the political establishment in Washington, regardless of whether it was run by one party or the other, understood this foundational reality. You do not mess with the wiring of the house you live in. You might negotiate. You might argue over dairy quotas or softwood lumber, but you do not threaten to blow up the foundation. Then came a radical, unprecedented escalation. In the opening days of the new administration, the strategy out of the White House was absolute overwhelming economic force. The America First agenda was put into overdrive, and Canada was placed squarely in the crosshairs. The administration announced a staggering 25% tariff on all goods coming from Canada and Mexico, a 25% tax. Let me make that simple. That is not a tax that the Canadian government pays to the American government. That is not how tariffs work, no matter how many times politicians claim otherwise. A tariff is a tax paid by the American company importing the good, which is then immediately passed on to the American consumer. It is a sales tax on your life levied by the White House. But it was not just the economic policy that shocked the international community. It was the rhetoric. It was the deliberate, humiliating degradation of a sovereign ally. In a highly publicized, deeply surreal meeting at a Florida resort, the president reportedly told Canadian officials that if Canada could not meet his demands regarding border security and trade deficits, they should simply become the 51st state. He suggested that the Prime Minister of Canada would make a great governor. The mainstream cable news networks ate this up. They played the clips on a loop. They convened panels of pundits to debate the tone of the remarks. They treated it as a brazen alpha male negotiating tactic. The assumption in Washington, an assumption built into the very DNA of the administration's trade policy, was that Canada would simply have to fold. The prevailing wisdom was that Canada's economy is roughly 1/10 the size of the United States economy. They need us more than we need them. They send over 75% of their exports to the American market. Therefore, if the United States applies maximum pressure, if the president threatens to tax their entire export economy into oblivion while simultaneously threatening their sovereign identity, Ottawa will eventually panic, return to the negotiating table on its knees, and accept whatever humiliating terms are offered. That was the calculation. It was a calculation based on an outdated assumption of Canadian political behavior, and it was a catastrophic miscalculation. To understand why the White House strategy failed so spectacularly, you have to look at who they were dealing with. The administration was acting as if they were still bullying the polite, consensus-driven government of the previous era, but the political landscape in Ottawa had shifted. The man sitting in the Prime Minister's chair was no longer a charismatic legacy politician focused on global public relations. He was a central banker. He was a technocrat with a resume that looks like it was engineered in a laboratory to handle complex, high-stakes financial warfare. He spent years running the Bank of Canada, safely steering the country through the 2008 global financial crisis while American banks were collapsing in spectacular fashion. He was so effective that the British government actually recruited him to cross the ocean and run the Bank of England, making him the first non-Briton to hold that post in the institution's 3-century history. He is a man who understands leverage, markets, and macroeconomic pain points better than almost anyone else alive. When the 25% tariff threat and the 51st state insult were launched, the Canadian Prime Minister did not panic. He did not rush to the microphones to issue a tearful plea for the historic alliance. He went to work. The first major public signal that the game had fundamentally changed came in January at the World Economic Forum in Davos, Switzerland. Historically, Davos is where world leaders go to give sweeping, optimistic speeches about global cooperation. But the Canadian leader used the platform to deliver a message directly to Washington. It was a message of unprecedented cold defiance. In what analysts are now calling the Davos Doctrine, he laid out a new reality. He stated unequivocally that Canada was done playing the role of the subservient younger sibling. He said, and I quote, "Canada does not live because of the United States." It was a stunning rebuke. It was a public declaration that the era of automatic American deference was over. He articulated a vision of a Canada that would no longer allow its domestic economy to be held hostage by the erratic political whims of the Oval Office. He argued that if the United States wanted to treat its closest ally as a hostile foreign competitor, then Canada would act accordingly. They would aggressively diversify their trade portfolios. They would seek out new partnerships in Europe, in the Indo-Pacific, and yes, even in areas that would make Washington deeply uncomfortable. He was signaling a strategic rupture. He was telling the world that the United States was no longer a reliable partner, and that the rest of the globe should adjust their supply chains accordingly. The White House dismissed the Davos speech. They viewed it as posturing. They assumed it was just tough talk for a domestic Canadian audience, a politician trying to look strong after being humiliated by the American president. They assumed that the gravitational pull of the American economy was simply too strong for Canada to escape, no matter what was said in Switzerland. They believed the 25% tariffs would eventually crush the Canadian resolve. But here is where the story turns. Here is what the administration failed to understand about the man they were dealing with and the country they were bullying. The Canadian Prime Minister's real weapon was not a speech in Switzerland. It was not diplomatic grandstanding. It was what he quietly, methodically authorized Canadian citizens and Canadian markets to do next. What the White House strategy failed to anticipate was that the Canadian leader was not just planning a government-to-government standoff. He was preparing to weaponize the very thing the president claimed to champion, the power of the consumer. In a move that caught the American Department of Commerce completely off guard, he did not just retaliate with matching tariffs on American steel or dairy, which is what everyone expected. Instead, he leaned into a grassroots, digitally coordinated movement that effectively told every Canadian citizen, if they do not want us as an ally, they do not need our money. Almost overnight, the Buy Canadian sentiment shifted from a quiet patriotic suggestion to a national economic directive. But it was not just about groceries. The real damage started at the border. You have to understand that for decades, American border towns from Maine to Washington state have survived and thrived on the Canadian weekend. In cities like Buffalo, New York, Bellingham, Washington, and Burlington, Vermont, Canadian shoppers are the lifeblood of the local economy. They cross the border to fill their tanks with cheaper American gas, to shop at major retailers, and to vacation in American hotels. In some of these regions, Canadians account for upwards of 30% of all retail revenue. But under the shadow of the 51st state insult and the 25% tariff wall, that flow of capital simply stopped. The Canadian government did not have to pass a law to make this happen. The rhetoric from the White House had done the work for him. The result was a vacuum. By March 2026, retail sales in U.S. border counties plummeted by an average of 40%. Malls in upstate New York that were already struggling began to look like ghost towns. Small business owners, many of whom had voted for the America First agenda, suddenly found themselves staring at empty parking lots and mounting debts. They were the first ones to realize that when you kick your neighbor, you do not just lose a friend, you lose your best customer. As the retail crisis deepened, the boomerang effect moved from the shopping malls to the factory floors. Remember those auto parts that crossed the border 7 times? Every time one of those parts crossed back into the United States, it was hit with that new 25% tariff. The cost of manufacturing a single pickup truck or full-size SUV skyrocketed by thousands of dollars almost overnight. American automakers already facing stiff competition from overseas were forced to choose between eating those costs and going bankrupt or passing them on to the consumer. They chose the consumer. The price of new vehicles surged, hitting American families right in the wallet. This is the irony at the heart of the 51st state bluff. The policy designed to protect American industry actually made it more expensive for Americans to buy American products. By the time the spring thaw hit the Great Lakes, the panic had reached the halls of Congress. This was not just a partisan complaint. Governors in the Midwest, men and women whose states rely on Canadian energy and manufacturing, began making frantic, quiet calls to the West Wing. They were seeing the data, they were seeing the layoffs, and they were seeing the Canadian Prime Minister doing something even more dangerous. He was meeting with the European Union and a coalition of middle powers to create a trade bloc that specifically excluded the United States. His masterstroke was proving that Canada could find other buyers for its oil, its wheat, and its minerals. He was not just reacting, he was diversifying. He was showing the world that the American market, while massive, was no longer the only game in town, and that it was becoming too volatile to be trusted as a primary partner. This leads us to the one number I promised at the beginning, the number that changed the entire picture. That number is 82, as in 82%. That is the percentage of the current U.S. trade deficit with Canada that is made up of essential energy and raw materials, things the United States cannot simply make at home in a weekend by forcing a rupture. The administration did not just tax Canadian goods. They taxed the very fuel and steel required to build the American greatness they promised. The fallout eventually forced a rare, panicked bipartisan rebellion in the U.S. Senate. Leaders from both parties began drafting emergency legislation to reevaluate the tariff structure, effectively trying to bypass the White House to save their own local economies from total collapse. It was a humiliation for the administration, a signal that the bullying model of diplomacy had hit a hard mathematical wall. So where does that leave us? The border is still there, but the trust is gone. The attempt to treat Canada like a hostile corporate acquisition did not result in a 51st state. It resulted in the most independent, most defiant, and most strategically distant Canada seen in over a century. The Canadian Prime Minister did not just defend his country. He outmaneuvered a superpower by realizing that in a globalized world, a bully is only as strong as his victim's dependence. And Canada just proved they are not dependent anymore. The story and the bill that the American taxpayer is currently paying is far from over. The next move in this North American divorce will change the map of the 21st century.